Great, welcome everybody. I'm Lucinda Platt and I'm chairing the seminar today. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Vernon, Gayle and Sarah Stopforth to give their talk on social class inequalities in school GCSE attainment. It's reading cultural capital. Vernon is Professor of Sociology and Social Statistics at the University of Edinburgh. He's also a co-director of the ESRC National Centre for Research Methods. And Sarah is Research Fellow at the University of Sussex and working on the Nuffield Foundation funded project, Ethnic Inequalities in Later Life. She's also an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Manchester. So welcome, Vernon and Sarah, and without more ado, I'll hand over to you to give the talk. You have about 40 to 45 minutes and then we'll open it up for questions and we'll do questions in person to you. Not exactly in person.
Yeah. Anyway, so thank you for your introduction. Thank you for the invitation. It feels incredibly weird being here in my spare room, and I think we've probably only given one other talk this year, which is also quite strange. Everything's been cancelled. I'll just stop. Could somebody indicate in the chat box if they can't hear me? So if you can't hear at this stage or you can't see the slides, say something and we might be able to do something about it. Okay, in the absence of any chat, I'll just crack on. So today's presentation is all about social class inequalities in school GCSE attainment, misreading cultural capital, and it's some work that Sarah and I have got very much work in progress, so we're looking forward to comments, and the work really emerges from some other work in her thesis. So essentially, in Britain, we've had a long tradition of sociological studies associated, looking into the association between family social class, a pupil's social class, or their family social class, and some aspect of education, going right back to these old sort of studies like Paul Corrigan's Schooling the Smash Street Kids, or Born to Fail, or something like David Hargreaves' Social Relations in the Secondary School, or Lacey's Hightown Grammar, or even sort of Ball's Beachside Comprehensive. So people have been looking at social class effects and school outcomes for a very long time. And is somebody not muted who should be, perhaps? If you could just check, thank you. So yeah, there's been a raft of policies and changes in education that really should have kind of leveled up some differences. So, for example, we've had now a long history of comprehensive, i.e. non-selective secondary schools. Most of them became non-selective in Scotland around the same time. England, it was a little bit slower, and so also true in Wales, but a very long history now, several decades of comprehensive, i.e. non-selective secondary schooling. The Education Reform Act is now sort of 30 years old, really, which established a national curriculum, which should have been a sort of equalising or levelling activity as it was seen at the time, and also the introduction of GCSEs as a kind of single-tier set of qualifications for young people, older pupils across the piece. So we've seen these sorts of these policy changes, these organisational structural changes that really have been in place for quite a long time, but we still see some social class-based inequalities in school outcomes. So I'm going to talk about GCSEs in a bit more detail very shortly, but GCSEs are still fantastically important in the individual educational biographies of young people. They tend to kind of filter people towards certain A levels, and many GCSEs are a prerequisite for studying the A level as well. They seem to affect the sorts of jobs people are able to look for at the sort of minimum, what was minimum school leaving age. They tend to affect the kinds of who's unemployed, who's not unemployed, the sorts of training and skills-based apprenticeships and so on that people are able to access. GCSEs are fantastically important and are sort of the first kind of major branching point now in the English education system. But they also have further implications for things like the jobs that people get after school, the rates of pay they have, the type of employment, the types of occupations, and even what goes on in universities. And we'll know from our own universities that certain GCSEs are prerequisites for studying certain courses over and above A-levels themselves. So GCSEs fantastically important in the individual trajectories and biographies of British pupils, of British young people. I'll just pause for a second and take a drink. So here we have some older data. I'm not going to talk about this graph in detail, but we'll come to some data like it very soon. So this is GCSE attainment in school year 11. If you're a bit old like me, you might call it the end of the 5th year. And here we've got family social class on the x-axis, measured by NSSEC, and we've got a mean GCSE score on the y-axis. And we really see this sort of downward trajectory, this sort of kind of downward slope. So those pupils from the least advantaged social classes in general, on average, having lower mean GCSE scores. And if you want to understand this in sort of John Goldthorpe type terms, this is the Salaria, or the professional social classes of 1, 1.2 and 2. And if these aren't familiar to you, I'm going to talk about them a bit more in detail in a moment. And these are the sort of intermediate social classes, and these are what Goldthorpe will call the wage earning working classes. So we see this sort of distinct pattern of a relationship between parental social class, family social class, and the young people, the pupils, GCSE attainment. And if we look at some more contemporaneous data, that's data from the 1990s cohorts. It's from the youth cohort study of England and Wales. But if we look at some more recent data, and this is a paper that I published with 2 other colleagues, Roxanne Connolly and Chris Playford, earlier this year, we see the same sort of downward pattern again. These are data from the comparatively recently, from about 2009 to 2013, and again we see the Salaria. If you're interested, if you use sort of Goldthorpe speak, or the professional social classes, the intermediate social classes, and then the wage earning working classes over here. And again, we see this sort of downward slope, this negative relationship between parental social class and GCSE attainment. So on to some of the theory now. So Bourdieu suggests that explains that the unequal scholastic achievements of pupils from different social class backgrounds is due to them having differing amounts of cultural capital. So that's essentially the concept in a nutshell, as much as you can get a concept as expansive as cultural capital into a single sentence. So cultural capital explains the unequal scholastic achievements of pupils from different social backgrounds. But recently, the idea of cultural capital has made a sort of hermeneutic jump from sociology departments to Ofsted, and the school inspectorate have recently become interested in inspecting schools in terms of the amount of cultural capital that they provide. And I'll read this quote. So this is from the recent document, the Ofsted document in 2019. And they say that as part of making a judgment about the quality of education, inspectors will consider the extent to which schools are equipping pupils with the knowledge and cultural capital they need to succeed in life. Ofsted's understanding of this knowledge and cultural capital matches the understanding set out in the aims of the national curriculum. It is the essential knowledge that pupils need to be educated citizens, introducing them to the best that has been thought and said, and helping to engender an appreciation of human creativity and achievement. And I'm going to return to that at the end. So Ofsted have become interested in cultural capital. What's our sort of research question? Well, the research question in the work we're presenting today is that we know that parental social class, certainly when measured by an occupation-based measure, is fantastically important, as is parental education, housing tenure, gender and ethnicity. But really, we want to know what sort of effect does cultural capital have in this sort of mix of this multivariate sort of mix, if you like, this confection of variables that seem to affect GCSE outcomes? And really, we think, well, you know, could cultural capital have a sort of direct effect on outcomes, which is sort of net of parental social class as measured by occupations? Or, you know, we could at least theorize that we would imagine that families from different social class backgrounds will have different levels of cultural capital, or may transmit different levels of cultural capital to their children. So could it actually be that, you know, if you measure cultural capital and include this in models of GCSE outcomes, the parental social class, the occupation-based measure, in some way will fall away or sort of diminish in importance or fade away? And at the moment, yeah, that's what we're sort of theorizing from the outset. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about school qualifications, as I realise we're not in an education department, and obviously for many people their own qualifications are now lost in the mists of time, a sort of strange mixture of GCSEs and CSEs perhaps, or some other qualifications. So I'll just talk about qualifications just so that you kind of are absolutely crystal clear on what we're looking at here. So GCSEs, these are the pupils, the qualifications that pupils commonly take, and the most popular qualifications that pupils in England and Wales sit at the end of year 11, so old fifth form. Most pupils will tend to do about 8 or 9. There isn't really a kind of fixed diet they have to take. It will be maths and English literature, normally a science. But there is a lot of choice, a lot of pupils' choice, a lot of parental choice, and some constraints around the school curriculum. So not all schools offer the same GCSEs, and there'll be timetabling constraints and so on. But most people will probably study for about 8 or 9 of these, sometimes 10, sometimes 11, but normally about 8 or 9 GCSEs. Each subject graded individually. So this person has studied for 8 individual subjects. Each one graded individually. The highest grade initially used to be A, and then it became an A star, right down to G. And this is slightly older data, so the new qualifications have a slightly different grading scheme, which I can talk about later, but it doesn't matter for the data we're looking at here. So A stars, very, very good, down through A, B, C, and so on. And in common with many other stratification education researchers, we give these a point score. So A star, 8 for an A star, down to 1 for a G. So this is our outcome measure in the models that I'm going to show you. The data. Well, almost every talk you go to, someone makes the point that the jewels in the British data crown are the birth cohort studies. And the first person I ever heard say that was Ian Diamond. So the irony wasn't lost on me, a man called Diamond talking about the jewels in the crown. So the jewels in the crown are obviously the birth cohorts, the 3 older birth cohorts, 46, 58 and 70. The participants in those studies are all kind of pre-GCSE. So they all got to the end of school before GCSEs. The people in the Millennium cohort, they studied for their GCSEs in 2017 through to 2018, depending on when their birth was. So that was another potential source of data for these kinds of analyses. But one of the issues is that the start of GCSEs, the youth cohort study of England and Wales, which is various cohorts between 1989 and 2007, provided a lot of information, school year cohort by school year cohort, quite often about young people, about their qualifications, about their participation in further and ultimate higher education training and so on. So there's lots of information in the late 80s through the 90s through to the start of sort of the 2000s. Next steps, which many of you will know, a single cohort. It started off as the longitudinal study of young people in England. They took their GCSEs in 2005 and 6. So quite a lot of information at that time, but you see this sort of gap really of 10 years between about 2007 and 2017. And that's one of the areas we're going to take a look at. Here we look at data from Understanding Society, the biggest, and some people would argue the best household longitudinal study in the world. It's a British study, began in 2009. Many of you will know it, but I can answer some questions, more detailed questions, if there are some. So we're looking at data from Understanding Society. So it fills this sort of gap between 2007 and 2017. These are young people born into the households in the study. And we've got the official data, the linked educational data from the Department of Education. So this is linking the survey data and the official administrative data. And what have we got? Well, we've got the outcome, which comes from the National Pupils Database, the GCSE, or the Key Stage 4 data, you might like to alternatively call it. That's what it's known as officially. So these are school GCSE results from 2009 and 10 through to 2012-13. From Understanding Society, we've got some household level information, some information from the fathers when they're present, from the mothers when they're present, and from the young people themselves. So we're bringing these data together in what I think is quite an innovative way. So social class measures. So thus far, we've been interested in social class in previous work, and we've tended to use the official measure, NSEC, National Socio-Economic Classification. And if you're not a stratification researcher, I always think that these codes here are not necessarily kind of that obvious. So I'm just going to take a minute to tell you which classes are which, so you can follow on, hopefully follow on a bit more straightforwardly. So at the top of the scheme, the head of the scheme are large employers and higher managers. So large employers and higher managers. Next are the higher professionals. So for example, if you were something like a university lecturer, you would be a higher professional. And the next class are the lower professionals. So if you're somebody like a school teacher, that's my sister there, she's a school teacher, you'd be in social class 2. And the irony has just hit me that of all the people I know, the two best accessorized people are now actually on the screen next to each other, which is unusual. So I digressed. So lower professionals, so for example, teachers, intermediate occupations, such as being a police officer, and moving along the scale, so small employers and own account workers. So somebody like a self-employed taxi driver. My father was a London taxi driver, so I chose that as an example. And then the lower supervisory and technical jobs, so for example, someone like a gardener, and then ultimately the semi-routine workers, so somebody like a care home worker, and then routine workers, somebody, for example, a cleaner. And then finally, those who have never worked and are long-term unemployed. So these are the sorts of occupations. These are just some of the occupations, give you an idea of how these classes kind of locate in the occupational structure in Britain. So that should give you some further idea. So yeah, so just in case, I always get students to guess that. So the first woman who was a large employer is Nish Katona, who owns Mowgli Street Foods. The woman who's a police officer is actually Sizzling Faye, the first black policewoman. And the woman driving the taxi was Tina Kiddle, the youngest ever woman to become a London taxi driver. I think she's now the mayor of, she's a mayor in Norfolk. I think it's Swaffham. But yeah, so she combines being a London taxi driver with being a mayor in Norfolk nowadays. So these are the occupations. So those occupations at the head of NSEC are generally more socio-economic advantage, and those at the foot of the scheme, less socio-economic advantage. And the scheme is really constructed around employment relations in the labour market. So individuals in classes share similarities. So for example, similar market situations. So two people in social class 1.2, for example, will have similar levels of income, economic security, and chances of economic advancement. And similar work situations. These are sort of two important components of NSEC. So for example, two people in the same class will have similar levels of authority and control in their occupations. And ultimately, people like Big Dave Pavilion would always say that people in the same classes share similar lifestyles and life chances. That's the kind of, that's the point here. So what's the operational challenge for us? Well, we know that these other things affect GCSE outcomes, but we want to understand the potential role of cultural capital. Well, Alice Sullivan says that Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital is not clearly defined, and it's not particularly surprising that it's been operationalized in various different ways. Similarly, someone like Robson says, of course, any results that emerge from an empirical analysis of cultural capital are directly contingent upon these definitional and measurement issues. And I'll just show you a quick few examples. So one of the problems is there's no agreed standard measurement of capital, cultural capital, that can easily be operationalized with existing social survey data. Different studies operationalize cultural capital using a wide variety of manifest measures. And for example, just to show you some examples, so there's a whole bunch of studies here, which I won't go through, which use highbrow arts and cultural participation. So things like attendance in museums, opera, the theatre, and so on. A bunch of other studies look at cultural knowledge or interests related to highbrow culture, music and literature. And others use things like the number of books in a childhood home. Other studies look at reading or language behaviours. Some studies use attendance in classes outside of school. Some use cultural possessions, and some simply use something like parental education level as the measure of cultural capital. So a really wide variety of approaches, often contingent on the data that are available. So we've said those two things already. Our problem is we're looking at large-scale nationally representative data sets, and these seldom collect suitable cultural capital measures. And obviously there are many studies where the sort of raison d'etre is actually to go out and collect some information on cultural capital, but within existing studies, there quite often are few measures that can be kind of shoehorned into analysis of cultural capital. And a lack of data sources suitable for studying social class. There are a lack of data sources suitable for studying social class and cultural capital in education. So, measuring cultural capital. Inside understanding society, we've got a bunch of measures on the parents and on the children. So, for example, highbrow cultural participation, we've got information on, does the parent go to the theatre, go to museums or galleries, go to visit historical places or stately homes, go to the opera or operetta, go to classical music performances, and then read some reading information. So does the parent read for pleasure, go to the library, is a member of a book club? And then on the child side, does the child go to the theatre? Do they go to museums or the galleries, historic places or stately homes? Do adults take them to the theatre? Do adults take them to museums? Do they read for pleasure? Do they go to the library? Do they discuss books at home? Are they given books by adults? So we've got a range of measures are potential candidates for studying social capital. And really, we saw this as there are two potential branching points. The first was kind of to take all this information and to put it into some reductive technique like factor analysis to try and reduce it in some way and make some sense of it. Or could we go forward with just more sort of raw scores about measure the amount of participation? And I'm going to very quickly show you both of these. How's time doing? 25 past should be fine. So first of all, a factor analysis. So we've got the parental information. So parents theatre going, museum going, historical places going to the opera, classical music and so on. So parental information, and the children's information on the other side, going to the theatre, going to museums, reading for pleasure, going to the library and so on. And to cut an incredibly long story short, we end up with these three factors. A factor that identifies kind of parental highbrow participation, if you like. So going to the theatre, going to museums, go to the opera and so on. Another factor that identifies all of the child's cultural capital, and a further one that loads on reading for the adult, if you like. So the adult reads for pleasure, the adult goes to the library, adult discusses books, is in book club, that sort of thing. So a model of GCSE, a straight regression model of GCSE outcomes with some control variables, but most importantly, parental education, housing tenure, gender, ethnicity, and parental social class measured by NSEC, the occupation-based measure, gives us an R squared in the unweighted model. This is complex survey data from Understanding Society, but the unweighted model has an adjusted R-squared of about 0.27 or 0.27 and a BIC of 6551. Okay, if we add the three factors, the three cultural capital factors, we get a slight improvement in R-squared, so from 0.27 to 0.32, and a reduction in BIC. Those overall goodness of fit measures are for the unweighted models. But it's only factor 2, the child's capital and the parent's reading, that are significant. The parent's highbrow factor is not significant in this model. So what happens when we look at a model now? So remember that the initial model had an adjusted R-squared of 0.27. If we now look at cultural capital in terms of the scores, i.e., how much of these activities does the parent do? How many highbrow activities do they participate in? How many highbrow activities does the child participate in? How many of the reading activities does the parent do? How many of the reading activities does the child do? We move from an adjusted R-squared of 0.27 to 0.31, so a mild improvement, but it's not a particularly more parsimonious model. And parental highbrow participation and child highbrow participation are not significant. It's only the parental reading activities and the child's reading activities that are significant. I'm going to turn now to looking at the patterns of NSSEC. So now we know a bit more about NSSEC. So at the bottom we have the parental social classes, NSSEC, and on the y-axis we have the regression coefficients, the betas, for the NSSEC in the model, in the initial model. So this is a model of just NSSEC. We see this now. I was going to say familiar to me, not necessarily familiar to you, but like the two slides at the start where we see this sort of this negative relationship as you move along NSSEC. So you move from the more advantaged classes to the less advantaged classes. We see an increasingly negative coefficient, so a negative effect so on GCSE score. What happens when we add the cultural capital factors? Well, again, we see the same sort of pattern. We don't see a kind of a real sort of fading away of the effect of NSSEC at all. We really see the same pattern. We see some minor variations, but we don't see this kind of pattern loosening at all. And then finally, similarly, if we add the if we've got NSSEC in the model and the cultural capital scores, again, we still see this negative effect. We see some minor variations in the exact coefficients, but we don't see the inclusion of cultural capital information in any way convincing us that NSSEC diminishes in its strength. And so basically this leads us to conclude that parental social classes measured by occupation remains kind of unchanged by the inclusion of cultural capital information. So I'm in fairly good time, so I'm going to start to make some conclusions before I go. So essentially, parental social class is an important determinant of young people's school GCSE outcomes. Parental social class measured by NSSEC explains about 16% of the variation in school GCSE outcomes. The other explanatory variables, including parental education, explain about an additional 10% of the variation in school GCSE outcomes. So 16% is down to NSSEC and an additional 10% of these other variables, including parental education. There are additional cultural capital effects, but these effects are small and only explain an additional 4 or 5% of the variance. Whilst parents and children in more advantaged occupation-based classes, on average, tend to have higher levels of cultural capital, the inclusion of cultural capital measures do not alter the overall pattern of the effects of parental occupation-based social classes, occupation-based social class. So occupation-based social class remains important. Goldthorpe, 2007, for example, warns us about the theoretical baggage associated with the Bourdieusian concept of cultural capital. And I think that's worth thinking about. The central message from this work so far, this study so far, is that parents and children's reading activities influence GCSE outcomes more than engagement in highbrow culture. essentially the message is reading is important. And some years ago, I met Stevie Haston, the old British mountaineer, who gave me a bit of advice. He said, Vernon, if you're ever reading something complicated, just do it between two chairs. And I think try it at home this evening. Well, you're actually at home now, so try it after this talk. Because Stevie's argument was that you don't understand the book any better, but at least you're still strengthening your core while you're doing it. And I think now I'm reading Kenwood and Carpenter's mind-bendingly difficult book on multiple imputation. So reading's important. You don't have to do it between two chairs, but at least give it a try once in your life would be my advice. On to some points about data. Well, if social scientists are serious about studying educational inequalities, then we must recognise the weaknesses in British data resources. Sarah and I believe that the absence of suitable youth data is a deepening crisis. The data portfolio was dented by the delay of the Olympic cohort. Some people call it the potential 2012 babies born in 2012, and it was then later harmed by the cancellation of the LIFE study. In our view, existing administrative data doesn't contain suitable explanatory verbals for comprehensive studies of educational inequalities. We argue, though, that well-planned data collection exercises are required, that researchers require large representative samples of pupils, that data must be collected from pupils, their parents and their households, and these data should be linked to administrative records and official information. So that's our position on data requirements. So going back to some theory now, so returning to the sort of the policy orientation. So obviously Ofsted recognises the importance, they say in their documents, of cultural capital. And this is really going to come to the fore in inspections. But meanwhile, this is a lovely quote in a Guardian article from John Goldthorpe. So it says, meanwhile, the sociologist John Goldthorpe, a critic of Bourdieu, says that the Ofsted handbook may reflect someone's vague recollection of what they were once taught at university. But he says, I don't see it as especially disturbing since the whole passage in the handbook is so vacuous as to be quite innocuous. So it's quite a harsh criticism, and he may be right. It's something for us to discuss anyway. So we would say that the document says that as part of making a judgment about the quality of education, inspectors will consider the extent to which schools are equipping pupils with the knowledge and cultural capital they need to succeed in life. Now, really, just to end now, will inspectors be able to observe, measure, and then analyse cultural capital in any meaningful way? We're not convinced that there's nothing suggests to us that they will definitely be able to do this. Finally, we would say, are we misreading cultural capital? Should schools be concentrating? The message here is that highbrow cultural capital isn't important. Reading type activities and behaviours are important, though. So should schools be concentrating on improving the reading of some of their pupils who are doing less well in terms of outcomes such as GCSEs? So I think I'm in good time, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good time. So we've got plenty of time for questions, which is always good. So if you have got a question, if you could put up your hand, I will look out for you. And there are quite a few of you here, but I will scroll up and down to identify hands and see what you want to ask Vernon. And Sarah, are you going to appear as well? So we can ask you both. So who would like to kick off? If no one else is going to kick off, I'll make a start.
Yeah, please do.
If that's all right, if I can abuse my privilege of chair. So I suppose my first question is your final point. So what is there in your analysis to suggest that the effect of reading is causal?
Yeah, well, nothing in the sense of it is correlational. Other than the temporal ordering of events may give us a little bit of a clue, because obviously this is data from the youth part of the panel, and the outcome is the outcome at the end of school. but yeah, it's you know, it's certainly is associational rather than causal.
So can you just clarify a bit more? So are all the measures of cultural capital measured before GCSE?
Sarah.
Yeah, they are. So all the measures of cultural capital are taken from the youth questionnaire, so they're aged kind of 10 to 15, and then the GCSE outcomes are when they're 15, 16, taken from the admin data. So yeah, there is the temporal ordering there for them. And we control for academic year in the models as well, which I don't think we said.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, well, with that one for starter, who would like to pick up from that? Stephen.
Hi, Vernon. Thanks very much. Really interesting. Learned a lot. Thank you, Sarah. I've got 3 small points. I'm a total outsider, so I'll probably say something odd here. Working backwards, you were very honest in saying that you were using unweighted understanding society data. Isn't that a no-no?
No.
Isn't it? Okay, you can explain that. Okay, come back to that.
All of the analysis are all SV-wide, so they're all appropriately they've all appropriately adjusted for the design and selection strategies. So we wouldn't do that. But what we were short of is suitable goodness of fit measures. So the goodness of fit measures I showed you, the R-squareds and the BICs, were from the unweighted equivalents of those models.
Because they don't work for SVY stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, as an outsider, cultural participation, I was really sort of bit puzzled by this, because it seemed all your measures of it are perhaps, if one talks about it generally, might be seen as investments in cultural capital rather than the cultural capital itself. I'm not sure what the accumulation of cultural capital is. So that's a sort of stupid economist remark, perhaps. Perhaps a related one was going back to your flow chart about the schematic model, about the directions. You had parental class and you had cultural capital. Both of them had arrows going to the outcome measure. And you also had an arrow that went from cultural capital to parental social class. So I thought, are you going to fit a model somehow where you have a potential path that goes from cultural capital to parental social class? Or indeed, might you have in your model cultural capital as being something that is between parental class and your outcome, in addition, so that parental class can have a direct effect and it can also have an indirect effect via cultural capital. So in a way, you're potentially underestimating the effects of parental background.
Yeah, Sarah.
No.
So on the first point about the cultural participation and investment, I think this kind of ties into the potentially the problem with data that we have as well, in terms of seeing if this is an accumulation. At the moment, all we can link is admin data from the first few waves of understanding society. So there's not actually the second look. So because of when the questions are asked and periodically, and the sample sizes, really we could only take it from one way. So we're kind of limited in terms of seeing if it changes over time currently, but I think that will change as more kind of data is linked. So that's something to kind of look to in the future. What was the second point was?
Oh, it's just the bit about the model paths and whether or not you'd investigated other, sort of approaches. The effect of parental background also having an indirect effect via cultural capital.
Yeah, so we didn't do this formally. I guess we looked at models with and without and seeing the effects on the social class coefficients. Like that's the kind of route we took, so we didn't really test that formally. But so on top of the factor scores, on top of the kind of sum scores that we've had, we tested everything separately and all the different individual measures separately, and none of the results changed. Like the social class coefficients kind of didn't really change too much. So we're kind of quite we feel the findings are quite robust in terms of these measures aren't really having the theorized effects on the social class coefficients.
But yeah, it could be a plausible avenue for investigation, couldn't it? About does cultural capital sort of sit on a path to GCSEs? One of the things I kind of always have in my mind, but the data don't support this, or there's no data that we know of that support this, is to what extent it always sort of, down the pub. We used to go down that place we used to go to down the pub. It always seems to me that sort of, things like going to the opera or whatever could affect something like GCSE music, but why it would affect GCSE maths or physics isn't apparently obvious to me. So I always wondered what would be happening at the individual subject level rather than the sort of aggregate outcome level. And that's just something we could just never easily get to. But I've often sort of wondered, or at least wondered about it. And I think if there ever were data, then that would be sort of. I think there would be. I'm fairly convinced there could at least be action there. That going to the theatre a lot could help your English literature outcome, or French cinema could affect, and so on. But I'm not sure what would help GCSE sociology, but
Thank you. Has that answered your question, Stephen? So I can go on to Anne now.
I think are you on mute, Anne?
I'm muted. It's fine. Thank you very much. I enjoyed your presentation. This is going back a bit, and I might have missed something, but three of your variables are likely to be highly associated. So education level of parents, social class, and indeed your cultural capital measures. I just wondered what the correlations were.
Yeah, VIFs are small, aren't they, Sarah? You probably know them off by heart, but
I don't know them off by heart, I'm afraid.
I think I could look, actually. No, I can't. I do know they're very small. The VIFs, they are. There are associations, but they're not as staggeringly high as you might think. They're quite the opposite. They're very low in regression terms, at least.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, there's no multicollinearity in the models. We check for that. So.
Right. Okay. That's really what I wanted to know. I just thought, what's the relationship between them all? So yeah, thank you. That's sort of helpful. Yeah. Thanks.
So is it Ivelina waving?
I think you're muted, Lucinda.
Ivelina, are you muted?
I just unmuted myself, but yeah, I think Lucinda was muted. Thank you for the nice presentation. Have you done split by gender and by migrant generation, for example? Because especially there are differences in school outcomes when it comes to gender in general, and with respect to migration, there are cases where the migrant generation, the parents might have higher education compared to the qualifications they have in the country of destination. In a way, they might have that cultural capital you're talking about, in terms of they might be recommending books to their children, they might be appreciating going to the theater, which is also related to resources and might itself be a function of class. But I'm thinking about, for example, people who moved from Hong Kong in the late 90s, or now there's research about Black Africans and Eastern Europeans being employed at occupations that are below their education. So have you seen, and in your result you show a very neat picture where social class and social capital follow the same trend in terms of the increasing magnitude of negative coefficients. Have you looked by migration generation where there might be a difference in more complicated patterns than that?
Yeah. Unfortunately, this would be a lovely thing to do. The data don't support that. It is understanding society. Understanding society is large and complex, and that's very good. There is an ethnic minorities boost, but these are children born into households that fit into this time frame that have also kind of consented to having their data linked from from the or their families have from the Department of Education. So the sample size is relatively low. In gender, well, you know, the gender effect is the normal one you'd expect from British data, with girls doing much better than boys at GCSE, and you know, I always think that's an amazing, that's sort of truly one of the sort of not sociological miracles, but one of the strange things, yeah, because you know, right, if you look at, I think the very first cohort of the YCS, you know, that's probably one of the last times that boys were outperforming girls. You know, all of the sociology of education, you know, in the sort of 60s, 70s and so on, was all about the underperformance of girls. And now, you know, virtually everything we can think about, you know, sort of in any sort of school level measure, girls always outperform, you know, young women outperform young men now. So, you know, it's an amazing kind of situation where the sign of the coefficient has flipped and the magnitude of the coefficient has sort of soared away. So yeah, it's very much how you would think that the sort of gender effect in this data is consistent with sort of virtually all other studies and the official data. Yeah, the migrant issue, unfortunately, we just can't get close to that at all. So yeah, it's just the data of the data.
So next we have Grace, I think, and then Caroline. So Grace.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. I've learned so much. I just wanted to ask about the measure you had about the highbrow, well, I guess your cultural capital measure. I was wondering if there was any variation in just more standard sort of activities that children are able to do, well, young people are able to do, sorry. Because I imagine that if you come from a lower social class, it's just the accessibilities to what normal people do every day might be very different, rather than just the difference between highbrow activities versus not. And that sort of affects who their peers are, I suppose, or whether they even have peers to begin with. And that might translate into, you know, opportunities to learn together and stuff for GCSE attainment.
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to take some?
Well, I kind of have to fall back on something we keep saying. We're within the limits of the data. I guess we're kind of at mercy of what has been asked. We do find that there are associations between parental social class, so bivariate associations between parental social class and parents' cultural capital activities, reading and culture, but not when it comes to children's, which is quite an interesting distinction. But yeah, in terms of peers and kind of what is available to the different young people, it's difficult to kind of get a grasp on that with the large scale data and just kind of the few people that fit all the criteria that we can actually run the models on. So yeah, unfortunate, we can't really see.
So we have a lot of people want to come in now. We've got Caroline and then Hartley. So Caroline.
That was really interesting. Thank you very much. And I'm someone who also grapples a lot with understanding society data. And so I guess my question follows on nicely from Grace's, which was thinking, you know, you're taking the questions that are asked within understanding society and you're limited by that. You have the, you know, by that because of its multi-purpose kind of nature. So, you know, struck by how well these questions do or don't capture kind of cultural capital across different cultures. Some of the activities do require money across kind of gendered interests. So I guess my question was, what do you think the major gaps are in terms of what those questions are actually capturing? So if you were allowed to add extra questions to understanding society, what would you add?
Yeah, I don't know. With Sarah and I've not discussed this, so we may have different views, but I would argue that my current view is that we really understand society isn't necessarily the place for this. If we're serious about this, if there is a serious interest in understanding educational inequalities, then we have to collect appropriate data. So, you know, I think we really do need to return to a youth cohort study style collection of data. So we actually need to be interviewing kids, surveying kids in the secondary school years, We need to be collecting information that makes sense in terms of their lives. We need to be interviewing or surveying, or questionnaire surveying, whatever, parents, getting household information, and then linking this with official data from GCSEs and other qualifications. And that's the appropriate way to do it, with sufficiently large samples and properly representative samples. So I think that's what we should be doing if we feel that this is an area that British social science should study. At the moment, we're making the best of kind of not suboptimal data resources, and I think that that would be the answer, that there should be appropriate data if we're interested in studying it. It all costs money and time, but if it's one of the things we think we should be doing, then I think we should at least try and do it properly.
But what measures, Vernon?
Sorry?
But what measures? I think you were asked about the measures. What measures?
Oh, what measures? Okay, sorry, I ranted then. Sarah, are you or do you have a different view even? We haven't discussed this, so.
So for me, I think what's clear is that there's such a massive operationalization challenge. If you pick up any paper or piece of research that's used cultural capital, it will most probably have used a very different measure to the next one you pick up, or a different combination of measures. So there's kind of that aspect that's troubling, because they're all under the same kind of umbrella term of cultural capital, but then you dig deeper and they're measuring quite different things. But for me, what comes out quite clearly from this work and also previous work, there's this distinction between highbrow culture and reading behaviours. And in previous work and this work, we find that it's the reading behaviours that's what kind of where we're finding most of the predictive value with educational outcomes. So for me, it's having more of an emphasis on the reading side of things. So the Millennium Cohort Study collects data on mothers reading to children or parents reading to children throughout kind of throughout their childhood. I think something like that could be quite interesting within understanding society, because you have the household dynamic. Just what people are reading. I know, like, you have these omnibus studies, so it's difficult you can't fit everything in, but I think that the type of thing, because just reading one type of thing, is that the same as reading classical literature in terms of what's going to get you a better result in an English literature exam or whatever it might be. So for me, more around the reading behaviours and what people are reading would be really interesting to see.
Thank you. I know we've got Hartley and then Sana, so we'll go in that order for the next questions. Thank you. Hartley, are you going to unmute?
Yep, I'm unmuted. Yes, coming to this interesting debate as a qualitative researcher, I guess it would be sort of heretical, perhaps, to suggest that maybe cultural capital is such an ephemeral thing that really it isn't susceptible to being captured by straightforward, calculable metrics. And because if I understand cultural capital, it's very much to do with adaptation to dominant cultural influences. So it's it's a sort of hegemonic adjustment, which can be captured, I think, in all sorts of ways through qualitative research. And I'm just wondering whether it's you're never going to actually get a satisfactory quantitative way, because the very nature of the concept of cultural capital. This may be heretical to this particular audience, but bits of what Vernon was saying, comparing what it is that people benefit from having their finger on the pulse of culture, the culture of the pub as opposed to the culture of the opera house. Is there's something more to this?
Yeah, well, it may be, but yeah, it would be interesting to have a sort of conversation with some of your colleagues across, I was going to say next door, but it probably isn't next door, in sociology, because I believe there are some of Bourdieu's messengers on Earth located there, and they're great advocates of A, of the work, and B, they're convinced that they can measure it through things like the Great British Class Survey and so on. yeah, I certainly rack. I don't want to sound like I'm too sort of a man who worries too excessively, but I do sometimes rack my brains, and we discuss things, and sort of with certainly my other colleagues, Chris Playford and Roxanne Conley, we talk about capitals and resources and so on. And yeah, we look at Bourdieusian measures like visiting a French restaurant. And we really think, well, does it matter that, if you go to your local Michelin star restaurant and it's, an Italian restaurant, does that really make a lot of, we go round and round in circles with these things. All of this work is really heavily influenced by, and I think lots of Bourdieu advocates would say this, lots of kind of slightly dated, at least in its masters, slightly dated aspects of what would count as highbrow culture, and maybe some of the other work on emerging culture might be informative here. But certainly something to think about, and something I've not, I go back and forth on, but there should there not at least a kernel of something that is measurable or capturable in the sort of classic orthodox sort of survey type, interview type measure that may come through in this? I don't know, Sarah, what's your view?
Well, I think there's quite obviously there's qualitative research on this and quantitative, and we have focused on the quantitative research on this, and there's such a long tradition of measuring cultural capital in all of these different ways, and really kind of boiling it down to quite simplistic yes or no, do you do this kind of things, and that is just there in the literature, and there's a lot of work looking at, well, what is the exact effect of cultural capital on different educational outcomes, and the problem is we don't know really how to measure it, but there's such a history of quantitative work doing that, and I think it takes on a kind of greater significance with the policy angle to it, with Ofsted introducing it into their policy inspectorate. Well, how are we going to actually measure this if we can't? It's very difficult to measure. Everyone measures it in a slightly different way. So kind of, the driving force behind this work is to build on previous, specifically quantitative research. Does cultural capital help us to understand the differences in GCSE attainment that we're seeing? So we're building on previous work, but also, increased significance of, well, Ofsted are going to have to measure this somehow, and how are they going to do that?
Okay, I'll move on to Sana if she wants to ask a question.
Yes, hello. Thank you for an interesting presentation. I'm sort of coming to this as a bit of an outsider to this specific area of research, so apologies if this is not a very helpful question, but I was just sort of wondering less about the sort of data and things and more about kind of the theoretical implications of what you've found, basically, like bearing in mind some of the discussion that we've just been having about how well can you really capture cultural capital if what your research is suggesting is sort of true, as far as you're able to tell that, perhaps cultural capital doesn't play that much of a role in influencing GCSE attainment over and above parental social class. Like, what does that mean for our theoretical understanding of how parental background and social class influence educational attainment, within a sort of Bourdieusian framework, which I understand you're using? Like, does that suggest that other things are more important, and what are they? How do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I suppose this, if nothing else, this is a straightforward assay of the idea of, could having some measures of cultural capital kind of be informative in terms of GCSE outcomes, and we're fairly convinced, at least in these data, that there's a mild effect, but the effect isn't about highbrow participation; it's about reading activities. So I think that's kind of where we're at. Obviously going back to Hartley's point, this is a real issue, though, isn't it? For because Ofsted are going to be inspecting schools, and classically in Ofsted sort of terms, you've got some whatever it is, a 58-year-old retired headmaster who, rocks up at such and such a school and is going to be making some judgments about how well the school are, equipping people with the knowledge and skills to be good citizens by giving them cultural capital. In some ways, it makes no sense, does it? It really kind of, to us as social scientists, it has a really kind of hollow ring to it. But maybe not if you're not in the Department of Education. Maybe this seems much more plausible. I don't know, Sarah. What would you like to say?
So I think whenever you read something about educational outcomes and the effects of social class, like the cultural capital tends to come up in sociology of education. Cultural capital is kind of held as this beacon of this is the reason why these social class inequalities exist. So that was kind of the first. That's why we looked into it in the first place. Well, let's see what happens here, and then there is this distinction made within the literature and quantitative work, specifically between the highbrow culture and the reading behaviours. And previous work, so Alice Sullivan has done work in this area, Crooks has done work in Australia, there's I think some De Graaf in the Netherlands, there's work that has made this distinction and tends to find that it's the reading behaviours that are the real bit that's doing the work. So I think if we're in a kind of theoretical world, is cultural capital helpful in this way? If we're kind of using just one aspect of it to mean, if we're finding that reading behaviours are the really important thing here, why don't we just use the terminology of reading behaviours? Because cultural capital can muddy the waters a little bit. So that's kind of my feelings on it at the moment, just based on the work and based on previous work that we've read as well.
Can I just pick up slightly on that? Because I think, as you said, Sarah, a lot of the literature said, okay, there's a social class effect, and that's in the absence of measuring it, you can attribute all sorts of things to what's the mechanism. So you can say that's cultural capital, that's the link between parental social class and GCSE outcomes. But if you're saying, and even with reading behaviour, it's not performing that role. So if you're saying it's not cultural capital, have you got anything else to fill the gap? Which I think was sort of part of what Sana was trying to get at. What you say? Why would going to the theatre affect GCSE results? Why would how does your father being a policeman rather than a care worker affect your GCSE results?
Yeah, exactly. Should it change our thinking about how parental social class sort of transmits an educational advantage onto their children? Your research.
Okay.
Oh, is it me, Bernie? Is this
yeah, go ahead.
I think, Sarah.
I thought you were. Yeah, sorry. I thought you were speaking. Go ahead.
Oh, I was kind of passing on to you. This is
okay.
More of a micro class.
This could take some time. Yeah, well, for a sort of for a number of sort of theoretical and sort of empirical reasons, and actually these data don't serve well for this sort of thinking. But I always think that there is some effects at the big agglomerate macro classes, as it were, but actually most of the activity is going on at a much more micro class level. So I think occupations are much more important than classes. So for example, if your mum's a pharmacist, she's going to be very good at helping you with GCSE chemistry. Yeah. But if your mum's a music teacher, she'll be very good at helping you with GCSE music, and so on and so forth. And I think that when we do look at certainly at older data that I've looked at, when we look at the within class differences, there are interesting occupational differences, and these are as important as some of the between class differences. Yeah. So I always think that a lot of the transmission is actually about a very sort of local family household level, is much more around sort of, occupations, occupational skill, occupational knowledge, and so on, connections and so forth, that can be passed to children, passed to young people in, either in the early phase of education or the later phases. So I'm quite a strong advocate of kind of, thinking much more at the sort of micro or meso class level rather than the big class level. But again, these data aren't the ones for that sort of for testing that sort of theory.
So you're a Grusky man, you?
Yeah, I would say so. Really, yeah, more of a Grusky man and a savage man, maybe on the continuum. You know.
So I saw in the chat there was
there? Sorry, yeah.
Or a question. So Andrew wanted to know whether you considered using structural equation modelling, and if not, why not? I think it's a brief summary of the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that would be an interesting avenue, wouldn't it? So, what's the old joke about what's the difference between a man from the mafia and a man from structural equations? One of them makes you an offer you can't understand. Yeah, I think that certainly, you know, a modelling framework, the sort of departure for us tends to be a sort of GLM type framework, and that's what we've done here. But certainly, you know, going back to Stephen's comment, you know, it might actually be worth thinking about it all in terms of, you know, path to something. So yeah, maybe a SEM approach could be a very useful next step. So yeah, it's worth thinking about.
Great. And Buckeye, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, it might be a bit of a silly question, sorry, but thank you for the great talk. I want to follow up on Evelina's question that she asked about migrant parents and so on. So you said that the data didn't allow you, but you're using understanding society data, which contains information about parental birthplace.
Yes. And
in another study, when we look at the calculation, it reaches to like quite a lot of UK parents' birthplace are not being in UK, like about 15-20% in our sample that I just checked with the data. Like when I think about cultural capital transmission as a migrant parent myself, like I don't know how to play the playground politics. I don't know how to actually talk and pressure the teacher. Like we don't have, like I might be going to opera theaters, have an eye education, but when cultural capital really matters, is to have that connection when a big chunk of the population is not going to be in your data. So I was wondering why didn't you use that information in Understanding Society? And
yeah,
the
sample size is fantastically small. Should I just start the answer to every question of the sample size is fantastically small because these are the children born in Understanding Society households that are in zone for GCSEs in the period for which there is linked data, which is from 2000 and, what is it, Sarah?
2009 to 2013.
2013. This is a small number, despite the large number of immigrants, or if you want to call them immigrants or migrants, in the boost sample and in households. So we have a very small number of people who are international migrants in the data. So yes, we would like to study this. We do not have sufficient data.
Who else would like to come in now? So Rana, you had a comment. Do you want to say your comment? Is Rana still with us?
And I believe that this is the heart issue.
Hi, sorry, I can't open my video, but yeah, I think it also relates to Berkay, and I think I understand the limitations of the data. I guess discussion. We're talking about cultural capital. I think just specifying that what we consider as cultural capital is having like participating in highbrow art and going to museums in itself, kind of like playing into the whole social class idea. And I think following on what Berkay said, I think it's also about trying to understand how cultural capital is played out in schools themselves, and how this then might have an impact on students' scores, especially what we know now with all the influence of teachers, for example, or on predicting GCSE scores and all this. So I guess there is something to know more about what is the conception of cultural capitals in schools themselves, rather than as a general idea of whether they go to museums or follow highbrow art. Yeah, so I think that was just a thought. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly this is something that education research is more ethnographic work in schools. Definitely that's something that could be studied. So
I'm aware of the time. I think there might be people who want to carry on the conversation, but I'm aware that it's now 6:10. I don't know with Vernon if you and Sarah can stay around for a few minutes if there are people who want to have a follow-up, continue the conversation.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So I'm going to suggest that I follow the practice that Burke had of let everybody goes who wants to, and if there are people who want to carry on a specific conversation with Vernon and Sarah about the topic, that they hang around now. So before we do that, I'll just thank you very much. For all those who are going to leave. Thank you, Vernon. Thank you, Sarah. Really, really interesting presentation. And I didn't know that bit about Ofsted at all. So I was really gave me a lot to think about. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.